Welcome back, everybody. AMEC 2012 Survivors, final session. Thank you so much for still being with us, and do appreciate the energy that you're putting into it and your time. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Don Bartholomew, who is the Senior Vice President of Digital and Social Media at Ketchum. Don he was going to come, but unfortunately he had to have a little procedure, which meant that he had to stay behind. But he was so keen to help us that he offered to get up at 4 o'clock, actually start presenting at 4 o'clock in the morning. We've allowed him a little lie-in. I think it's about 5:30. But Don is in Dallas, in Texas, in the United States. He's going to appear as if by magic. Hopefully you can hear me.
It wasn't the boy. Oh, there he is.
There he is. And Don, I hope you can, this is Dublin calling. So, ladies and gentlemen, Don Bartholomew.
All right, thank you very much, Richard. I'm extremely pleased to be able to join you, albeit remotely, this morning. As Richard said, I had a little issue where I couldn't travel quite this quickly, but had very much hoped to be there, and I've really enjoyed following the conference on Twitter. Actually, it's been very interesting. So my job this morning is to talk about, if we can go to the next slide, please. My job is to talk a little bit about social media impact and business value, those downstream metrics we get to after we've talked about engagement, after we've talked about influence. Then we want to talk about what impact are we having on the business and what value are we bringing. So if you go to the next slide, please. All right. The measurement model you see here is just one of several different ways to represent a social media measurement model. This one could actually be easily done in the valid metrics framework. You may see a little bit of that from Mike Daniels later. Basically, the model starts on the left with awareness. Those are the exposure and audience-oriented metrics. We move then to engagement, which is arguably the sweet spot of social media measurement these days. We talk about, are people engaging with our content, how are they engaging, and who are the people that are in fact engaging with that content. And then we get to impact. And impact metrics, for the most part, are outcomes. They're what happens as a result of engagement with our content. So it's things like change in attitude and opinion. Have we created a situation where people are more likely to recommend the brand? Are there change in net promoter score for the type of company that's following that? So it's those set of outcome-oriented metrics that are impacting the business. And then finally, we get to value, which in most cases, there are some intangible values, certainly around brand and reputation. But for the most part, when people talk about business value, they mean financial value. So it's things like sales, purchase frequency. Some companies are oriented more toward customer lifetime value. And keeping in mind, too, that ROI happens in one of three ways. Either we've increased sales, we've saved cost, or we've avoided cost. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. It's a bit of a convoluted slide, but the point here is that sometime in 2010, you can argue roughly mid-year, social media kind of jumped the chasm from being an experimental phase in most companies to now it's actually trying to drive real business processes. And with that change, that mainstreaming, if you will, of social media marketing, came a new requirement to be more accountable for what we're doing. It's no longer, when you're experimenting, it's fine to say, give me $50,000 to do this program so I can hire someone and implement a Twitter program. It's quite another thing when we're trying to ask for much bigger budgets. With that comes the need for accountability. You see in the upper right corner, part of the tension here is that only about 20%, this is a marketing Sherpa study that was published by eMarketer, and only about 20% of the people actually are seeing measurable ROI in their social media. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but only 20% are actually measuring it and seeing that ROI. if you look in the lower left corner, this is a study of CMOs, and part of the problem is when you ask CMOs what they're measuring those metrics that are back in the audience level. So it's likes, friends, followers, and engagement-oriented metrics. And you'll see down here, the second to the last line to the bottom, only about 25% were trying to tie social media in any way, shape, or form to sales. So kind of the elephant in the room here is that when we start to talk about social media being mainstreamed, the elephant in the room becomes social media ROI, and we have to do a better job as an industry, both educating people what that means, what conditions are appropriate for ROI, which ones are not so appropriate, and how are we going to execute against that requirement. Next slide, please. Thought we would take a step back. If we're going to talk about aligning what we're doing in social media to the business, that has a requirement from a metrics perspective. So if we think about where metrics come from, really I would argue there's three major buckets of metrics. First of all, there's programmatic level objectives, which drive very specific metrics tied to programs, campaigns, initiatives, things of that nature. Next, there are channel-specific metrics. So Facebook has talking about this, Pinterest has pins, Twitter has retweets. There are very specific metrics that only apply to specific channels. And generally speaking, the industry probably spends a little too much time with channel-specific metrics and not enough at the programmatic and business outcome level. And finally, the business outcome metrics are those metrics designed to measure the business impact of what we're doing. So if we think about what parts of the business are being touched and driven to some degree by social media, that's probably marketing for most companies, but a lot of companies, particularly with Twitter, it's about customer care, customer service. There's innovation through crowdsourcing, employee engagement, talent acquisition. There's any number of ways that social media can help drive the business forward. Excuse me, and we want to try to get a set of metrics, a rich set around business outcomes, as well as the other two areas. So if you go to the next slide, please. We saw on the second slide, from a metrics perspective, what some of the differences are between value and impact. I wanted to go through just some of the other differences because I think it's an important distinction between impact and value. So if we think about impact, it's primarily process-oriented. It happens over time. If you think about changing someone's attitude or opinion, that's not the sort of thing where you're going to send a tweet or write a nice blog post or even in traditional media get an article and suddenly fundamentally change the way someone's belief system is set up. You may plant a seed, but you're probably not going to have that revolutionary a change. So it happens over time. Value, for the most part, is transactional and happens at a point in time. So a fundamental difference there is much more short-term oriented. If you think about something like return on investment, when the cash register rings, that's when you configure ROI. It's transactional. Impact has both tangible and intangible components, whereas value is primarily, although not exclusively, but primarily financial. It's very tangible. When most people talk about value, they really mean financial value, although, as I mentioned earlier, there are intangible values around brand and reputation, for instance, but most folks really mean what's the ROI, what financial impact are you having, and what value are you bringing to the organization. We talked about some of those examples of impact earlier, so in the interest of time, I won't go through those. I do want to make the point that in some cases, I would argue that ROI is actually being over-applied with respect to social media. And by that, I mean not all programs are designed to generate ROI in the short term, yet management might put a requirement of ROI on the program. So there's a fundamental tension between those 2 points. And I think we have to recognize what the I stands for in return on investment. A lot of companies, if you're just getting into social media or social business in a big way, you may very well be in an investment phase in social media. You're not at the point yet where you're going to see the returns that you will downstream. So it's important to make sure there's some sense of alignment. It's a good conversation to have. Are we in an investment phase? Are we in a return phase? Where are we in that continuum? If we go to the next slide, please. I also think it's helpful to think about impact and value as a two-step process. We always want to try to measure social media impact. At that point, we want to ask ourselves, do we have the time, the budget, and perhaps the data to actually try to attribute value to the impact we're seeing? So the two-step process, I think, is a good one to go through. It helps clarify what we're doing. Also, in a lot of cases, the ROI of ROI studies is not great. You've probably heard that phrase before, but what that really refers to is if you have a relatively modest program, let's say of $100,000, you can't spend $50,000 to prove that the other $50,000 work. That's just not practical. That's not a good decision. So in those cases, we either have to find a less expensive way to actually attribute value, or we have to storytell around the impact and describe how that's helping move the business forward in very explicit terms. I think if you can do that, a lot of cases that's enough. The key performance indicators are all pointing in the right direction. We're seeing positive results. It's a reasonable leap of faith then that we are driving, in fact, financial value for the company. Whether or not we go to that extra step to prove that is a business decision. So if we go to the next slide, please. If social media ROI was really easy, everyone would do it and do it well. But the simple fact is it's quite difficult. There's no off-the-shelf ROI tool that really works. ROI calculators, for the most part, are a marketing gimmick. They don't really measure the right things. And most ROI studies, therefore, are custom. So if we look at today's multi-channel, multi-screen, online, offline world, you'll see a lot, I think, in the coming year about four-screen measurement, talking about TV, tablets, phones, and computers. Fundamentally, that creates a lot of challenge from a measurement perspective. So if we're operating all in the digital world and we're on a single channel, that's relatively easy. Unique URLs, landing pages, things of that nature. We can follow the conversion funnel down and do a reasonably good job on ROI. But as we become highly integrated, use multiple channels, we're talking online, offline, mobile, real world, people making true word-of-mouth recommendations, that becomes a very, very difficult proposition. The two fundamental issues anytime with ROI are isolation and attribution. We have to isolate the contribution of the particular program or initiative, and then we have to have a scheme to attribute value to that versus all of the other ways that value was created in the process. And then finally, data availability is another significant challenge. You'll find that in order to do modeling, for instance, you typically, most modelers will require 2 years worth of social media data in order to work the model. So a lot of data is necessary. If you go to the next slide, I mentioned modeling. We think at Ketchum that advanced analytics and modeling are really now coming to the forefront as a serious way that we can start to think about describing that value and, in fact, doing ROI studies. And increasingly, consumer companies, the large consumer packaged goods companies, are doing statistical modeling and have for a while. The difference now is that social media is being put into those models. And the one here, my colleague David Rockland, if you run into him at the conference, can tell you more about. This is actual data. It's actually PR data in this case. And you'll see the contribution that PR makes to the overall grand scheme of things. Again, the constraints here are the standard ones: cost, data availability, and then expertise. These models are non-trivial to develop. For instance, just determining the base volume, that volume that occurs in the absence of promotion, is a pretty tricky proposition statistically. So in our case at Ketchum, we actually partnered with a company called the Modelers that has 6 PhDs that are extremely good at this, and we're jointly working this problem. So if you go to the next slide, please. I think most people, when we talk about return on investment, first of all, think instantly of sales and not cost avoidance or cost savings. And they also think this is going to be really expensive. So I wanted to share with you kind of a fun little case study. This is a Twitter ROI case study that was very inexpensive to execute, and I think very clever in the way it was done. It was done by a colleague of mine in our Chicago office while he actually worked for this company that we're going to talk about. So this is a major insurance carrier. They monitor Twitter with a very specific purpose. You may have heard this listen with a purpose is a good way to think about social listening. It's much richer that way than just listening, kind of to the big noise out there. This company very specifically listens for customers that are either considering cancellation or non-renewal of some sort. So if they say, this company's not good, I had a bad experience thinking about switching, all of those kind of conversations in social, they are flagging those. And then they're doing a little work in determining the actual names of the individuals were available that are having these conversations, go into their customer database and match. And at that point, they can also determine the customer lifetime value of that specific individual. So we're not talking in the abstract now. We're actually down to individual names at this point. And basically what the team did was figure out the total cost of the social media program, calculated the average of all these lifetime values of these at-risk customers, and determined that was on average about $500 in net present value for each customer that they were able to save. And this program's been going on a little while, and it varies, but they are now saving 15 to 30 customers per month just with this very, very modest program, very targeted, very focused. I just thought this is a really clever way to think about calculating ROI, and again, very, very low cost in this particular case. So if we go to the next slide, they say most people only remember 3 things that you hear in a presentation. So this is what I hope you remember from my brief comments this morning. That first of all, it's really important to push beyond awareness engagement to try to get to measure impact and value. If the business imperative around social media is such that we have to be accountable, we're going to have to get better at doing the impact and business value part of the metric scheme. I hope you have a little better feeling now about the difference between impact and value. Both are essential to do. We always want to measure impact, and we want to measure value when we can, wherever it's appropriate to go to ROI, again, with those constraints primarily being time, money, and data availability. So with that, if you'll go to the next slide, I will thank you very much for your time this morning. And if we have any time, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very, very much.
Don, I'm gonna start by asking you a question. You showed us a slide with econometrics on it. I guess a question I've got for that is how accurate do you think econometrics really are? In that you mentioned the firm that you use have 6 PhDs, very brainy people, but I kind of feel like it's a search for holy grail, that we're always trying to attribute what causes certain effects and attribute it to certain causes. Are we ever actually gonna get there accurately, or do you think it's an impossible task? So what's your view, a PR measurement expert who understands this stuff, what's your view on those challenges?
Well, Richard, I missed the first part of your question, but I think that I got the gist of it. And let me say, first of all, that marketing mix modeling is better for some companies than others. For instance, if you have through channel visibility, if you have retail presence all the way through manufacturing, then you can do things like match the SKUs that you're promoting in a particular geography to what's moving off the shelves in those geographies, helps tighten the model quite a bit. Consumer packaged goods companies seem to be very strong and very committed to marketing mix modeling. For business to business, generally speaking, if you're talking about lead generation, that wouldn't make sense whatsoever. So I think in certain cases, it makes sense. In other cases, it doesn't. There is a financial hurdle to developing a model that for a small company probably would be prohibitive. Data availability is an issue. And then finally, I think a real challenge with social media in these models is historically, when you think about normalizing the data in these models, it's been done around impressions. So with PR data, typically you would factor the impressions qualitatively to try to make the model a little richer. But if you think about social media is not really good at the eyeballs game. It's really an engagement game. So if we're putting eyeball-oriented metrics or audience size-oriented metrics in the model, that's not going to put social media in a good light. So I think that's a challenge going forward is how do we normalize social media data such that we can take advantage and get credit for the engagement, the interactivity that social media drives that other mediums perhaps don't. And in other cases, value attribution modeling might be a better way to go. I think there's a whole host, exposed, not exposed. There's a lot of different research techniques we can use, and we should only apply market mix modeling in those cases where it really makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with your point about it should be engagement, not impressions. Another question for you is how widespread do you think market mix modeling is in businesses? And my understanding is that the way these models largely work is that if you don't put a feed in for public relations, they have to force an effect such that public relations, if it's not fed in with a data input, will show as having no effect. Is that a risk to our clients if we're not working with organizations to help feed data into these type of models?
Yeah, I mean, Richard, it's interesting. I've had this happen to me, I think, 3 times in the last few years that I've been talking to a company, they already have a marketing mix modeling or an ad spend optimization model, which is a unique implementation thereof, and they've not had PR data in the model. And we've gone back with whatever firm they've used and actually worked with them to get that PR data in. And you're right, basically the model has to shift to accommodate this new PR data and to actually assign a contribution to sales of PR. And in every case, what I found is that on the grand scheme of things, the contribution of something like PR is relatively modest, 6, 7, 8%, may be common for some CPG companies, but the ROI is almost always the highest of all the communications disciplines.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we have a question from the floor. No, can we have the microphone?
Good morning, Dawn. It's Jonna with Burrell's Loose. Thank you for getting up and being here with us today. You're always so kind. You know, in the presentation yesterday, they were talking about such a small percentage of media is really part of kind of the overall measurement of groups. And a lot of what we talk about for PR value is still based around media. Do you see that, I mean, the reality is that when we look at market mix modeling as we gravitate towards that area, media definitely impacts it. And I talk about media in the scope because I do believe that traditional media now, as we previously defined it, is very socialized on most mediums. So do you see any ability for this group as part of the social media standards moving towards inserting media, the earned media, as part of the marketing sphere to be able to include that so that PR always has kind of a transition there as opposed to just being able to kind of correlate things, but to make sure that they do have accountability there since they are driving a lot of those messages? Do you have any
Right.
experience with that with your clients?
Yeah. Well, first of all, whenever we reduce public relations to media relations, I think we do a disservice to the industry. And we have to be careful that we recognize that PR contributes to an organization in many, many ways beyond media relations. So that's always my first concern when we are, to your point, just attributing value around the media side of things. And certainly, that's one of the challenges. I mentioned this concept of isolation. And fundamentally, we're educating our people. We're trying to drive more and more integration across marketing. And at the same time, then, we need to disaggregate things on the back end to try to assign credit for individual disciplines. It's a bit of a mismatch in thinking there. We want to be highly integrated. We know, for instance, that advertising works better in a time when you have good publicity going on. All these things do work together. There's social components of traditional media, certainly. And it is difficult. And again, I think if it wasn't for budgets, if someone had all of the budgets under their purview, then maybe we would look at the totality of programs a little more and less at each individual discipline. But the simple fact is most organizations are siloed. There is a competition for dollars within that organization, and each function has to prove their value independently and collectively. So I'm not sure I answered your question fully, Jonna, but it was good to hear your voice. Wish I could be there.
Thanks, Don.
So we have another question from the front, please, for the microphone. with Mike Daniels.
Thank you. Mike Daniels. Hi, Don, and very pleased that you got up so early for us. This is actually a question that is related both to the market mix model that you've been talking about in relation to value calculations, but also relates to an insight that I gained from you, actually, just in our conversations over the last couple of weeks, which reflects something that I think we're going to be needing to talk about with the valid metrics frameworks, which I'm going to be talking about at some point in the future. One of the things that you discussed with me was what are the characteristics of social media environment is that you may, in the valid metrics framework, not have something called the activity line, because conversations can self-ignite within the social media environment. Those self-igniting conversations or self-creation conversations can have massive impacts, both positive and negative, of course. Now, the thing about market mix modeling, as far as I've delivered data to market mix models in the past around the traditional media environment, is that you always know that there has been an activity that's had a value, a cost attached to it, that's generated certain results, which is what we would always calculate. In the social media space, where we're talking about both, in a sense, active and passive coverage, do you think that it's going to be critical for us to find ways of understanding the percentage of conversations which happen from stuff that we do as practitioners from stuff that just happens? And what would we do with the stuff that just happens? Does it count?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Mike, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I guess my reaction to that would be that is part of social, that we want to, because people feel passionately about the brand, and sometimes not always positively, that they actually create content on behalf of the brand. They become advocates and evangelists. If you look at some of the models, like Forrester's own shared and earned model, basically their mentality is that you earn mentions in social because of the power of your brand, not because you necessarily sent out a tweet that got retweeted, but if someone talks about the brand, you've earned that through the presence, reputation, footprint of your company. So it is a very interesting question. My sense is that it's not going to be too important. I think we look at this through the lens of the consumer. The consumer doesn't really care who created the content so much. They're reacting to it and perhaps creating their own content. So it may be an important distinction, but right now I'm thinking that in social, it's not going to be that meaningful to make that hard distinction between what we did and what the community did on our behalf.
Okay. Well, that will be it for questions. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, I'd just like to say that I've had the privilege of knowing Don since about 2005 when I met you over lunch in Dallas, I think it was, or Austin. And Don is categorically one of the smartest thinkers, I believe, in our industry. He has a great way about him of expressing what are often very complex things in an easy to understand method to follow. And I think as we think about our challenge of educating the industry, the contribution of people like Don Bartholomew is significant. And Don, if you don't know, writes what I think is one of the absolute best blogs in our space, which is called Metrics Man, and you can find it at metricsman.wordpress.com. So I would urge you all to sign up to receive it. He doesn't post too frequently, but every post that he does is gold dust. So please do follow up and sign up to that and read it. But so please, everyone, join me in thanking Don very, very much. Don, thank you.